Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. In 2020, some on the left hoped, and maybe even expected, Texas to go blue for the first time in decades. However, that's not what happened, and under Republican control, the state actually seems to be getting redder, with some new, very contentious laws about abortion, gun control, and the teaching of racial issues in schools. So let's explain why Texas is getting redder, despite voters getting bluer. Before we start though, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell. Doing so not only ensures that you'll get more content from us, but also helps the channel out, which we'd really appreciate. So we're going to split this video into three sections. First, we're going to give you a bit of context and explain how the Texas state government works. Secondly, we're going to explain what happened in the last legislative session, which just finished. And then thirdly, we're going to explain why it happened. So let's talk about Texas's state government. The Texan government has two legislative chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House has 150 members, of which today 83 are Republican and 67 Democrat. And the Senate has 31 members, 18 of which are Republican and 13 Democrat. The Senate is led by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who was directly elected in 2015, and then all bills need to be signed off by the governor, Greg Abbott. Both Patrick and Abbott are Republicans. In fact, all of Texas's directly elected executive positions are currently filled by Republicans. For a bill to become law in Texas, it needs to get a majority in both the House and the Senate, and then the governor has 10 days to veto it. If the governor does decide to veto it, he can only be overridden by a 2/3 majority in both houses. We should mention that both houses also require a quorum of 2/3 of all members for bills to pass. Basically, you need at least 21 members of the Senate and 100 members of the House to be present for a successful vote. So that's how the legislature works. But unlike most other state legislatures, which meet annually, the Texas legislature only meets once every 2 years. Usually, the Texas legislature convenes on the second Tuesday in January of odd-numbered years, and has a maximum length of 140 days. As 2021 is an odd-numbered year, the 87th legislative session began on January 12th, and ended 140 days later on May 31st. Anyway, we're doing this video because it was a pretty controversial session. There were some uncontroversial bills, like SB 3, which requires suppliers to winterize their equipment to prevent another blackout like the one that happened in February, and SB 827, which caps the cost of prescription insulin for insured Texans. But there was also a whole load of legislation about what we might describe as culture war issues, known in Texas as red meat issues. Perhaps the three most controversial bills that passed this session were SB 8, HB 1927, and HB 3979. SB 8, known as the Texas Heartbeat Act, makes abortion illegal if a heartbeat is detectable. This is usually taken to mean about 6 weeks into pregnancy. It's worth noting the obvious here, that 6 weeks can only be 2 weeks after a missed period, and there won't really be any signs of obvious pregnancy at this point. And the only exception to this is when there's a medical emergency, and there's no exception to cover cases of rape or incest. Now, other states have tried to pass laws of this kind in the past, but none of them are currently enforced because of legal challenges. To get around this, the Texan law says that the state doesn't need to be the one who enforces the law. Instead, any private citizen can sue anyone who aids or abets abortion care or intends to help an abortion patient. It's not entirely clear what this means in practice though. Whether it would include, for example, someone who donates to an abortion fund, or only the doctor performing the procedure. It's also worth noting that whoever is sued has to pay a minimum of $10,000 per abortion if they lose the case, but they cannot recover their legal fees if they win. The next is HB 1927, known as permitless carry if you're a Democrat, or constitutional carry if you're a Republican. It allows anyone over the age of 21 to carry a handgun with them in public, without having to go through training, fingerprinting, or background checks. Basically, the only people who aren't allowed to carry are felons, and the punishment for carrying as a felon is a second-degree felony with a minimum of 5 years in prison. The third and final controversial bill was HB 3979. which aims to ban the teaching of critical race theory in schools, and ban schools from requiring teachers to undergo any sort of racial bias training. While this bill isn't as controversial as the other two, insofar it's more popular with the general population, it's nonetheless a classic culture wars issue, which is why it's made headlines. Those three bills were perhaps the three most controversial bills which passed in this session. However, this session was also controversial for the bills that didn't pass. SB 29 would have prevented transgender students from joining sports teams which match the gender which they identify as. SB 1311 would have jeopardized medical licenses for physicians who prescribe hormone therapy. And SB 1646 would have classified transition-related medical care as child abuse. However, all of these bills missed their procedural deadlines, and as such, weren't able to pass. The biggest news of the session came on the last day, when House Democrats walked out of a vote on SB 7, a voting reform bill, denying the 100-member quorum required to pass legislation. Nominally about preventing voter fraud, SB 7 would have required new voter ID for mail-in voting, made it a felony to provide mail-in ballot applications to third-party groups, eliminated drive-through voting and 24-hour polling centres, as well as granting so-called poll watchers free movement within a polling place, except when a voter is filling out their ballot. Democrats accused this bill of voter suppression, and Biden described it as wrong and un-American. In response, Texas Governor Greg Abbott said that he would add SB 7 and HB 20, a bail reform bill, to the special session agenda. According to Texan law, only the governor can call special sessions, and while each session has a limit of 30 days, there's no limit to the number of consecutive sessions a governor can call. So in practice, he can keep the legislature going as long as he wants. Abbott has even threatened to deny the legislature pay if they don't pass, or at least vote on the bills. So that's what happened. It was, in Abbott's words, one of the most conservative sessions that Texas has ever seen. You might be asking at this point then, how come this session was so conservative, when in the 2019 legislative session, Republicans controlled the Senate, House and governorship, but stayed well away from red meat issues, and just focused on budgeting and tax reform? Well, that would be a great question, and there's sort of three reasons. Firstly, Texas received more tax revenues than expected, which meant that boring budgetary issues didn't need that much attention. Secondly, Democrats did far worse than expected in 2020, which means that Republicans aren't worried about losing their seats to Democratic challengers, so don't need to pitch to the center ground as much. Instead, they're worried about losing to Republican challengers in the primaries, which are coming up next year. This leads us nicely onto the third reason. In a post-Trump Republican Party, you can never really be too far right on social issues like these. Essentially, if you're a Republican legislator, the best way of defending yourself in the primaries is to make sure you're to the right of the next guy. Republicans therefore have to play a delicate balancing act of making sure they're far enough right to screen off any primary challengers without alienating too much of the general public and letting a Democrat steal their seat. So that's why the Texas legislature is getting redder despite the state getting bluer, and the influence of Trump and Trumpism on the state. What do you think of these new policies though? Are the GOP right to be pushing policies like this after their 2020 win in the state? Or do you oppose these contentious new laws? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.